We're going to continue now with the panel discussion, so we're open to any questions from the audience for any of the panelists. I think I'll take the liberty of starting. I have a question for you, Joyce, regarding the African American sequencing project. I'm currently a researcher at New York University, and all of my research is on African Americans, looking at genomic and psychological factors on hypertension. And we are currently doing some sequencing. How would we partner with 23andMe with the samples that we currently have, or with other groups of African Americans that may participate in our research to have their genome sequenced?
So that particular study with the sequencing of African Americans was a grant from the NIH, and so that data is now available on dbGaP for anybody who wants access to it. But in addition, we have a number of different academic collaboration programs. Those are all, I mean, they're pretty much all free collaborations. And so we definitely welcome all, there's like a 2-page proposal that you fill out, but we definitely welcome any kinds of requests for collaboration.
Hi, I'm Aaron Goldenberg from Case Western. Wonderful panel. Thank you to all the speakers. That was really, really great. When we've been thinking and talking today about issues of disparities, issues of the impact of direct-to-consumer tests on disparities, we've been mostly focusing on issues of inclusion, issues of accessibility, understanding, and I think those are all incredibly important. But I'm wondering if any of the panelists might talk a little bit about how we better contextualize results from these tests within the context of social determinants of health as well, right? So it's easy for us to think, well, if we fix understanding, if we fix accessibility and understanding and access, that this information will have significant impacts on the health of these individuals, and it may. But I do worry that we're sometimes having these conversations separately and not thinking about how an individual, a family, a health clinic might also think about these results within that larger, broader social, environmental determinants of health. So I'll open it up to anyone, but I've just been thinking about that a lot as we've been talking.
I can start. So it's something that we're very interested in. Obviously, you know, we all know that genetics is only a small part of the equation for most conditions, and in many cases, it's the lesser part of the equation for many conditions. And so, you know, how can we help people sort of put it in context with all the other kinds of things, diet, exercise, stress, that may impact their risk for developing a condition. I think one of the things, there's 2 things that I think that we struggle with. One is that it's not super useful for a consumer if you're like, well, you know, here's your genetic risk, and then, okay, here's your risk based on these other factors, right? And, you know, here's a whole bunch of different risk scores, and go ahead and attempt to integrate it, right? So what they really want is like one unified score, right? Or some sort of result. But the data for that don't really exist yet, right? There's not a lot of, there aren't a lot of cases in which people have created models in which they've integrated both genetic and non-genetic information together to provide something that's useful and meaningful. And so really we're having to do the research, right, in order to develop those models. And I think we have a good opportunity to do that with the data that we have, but it's I think early stages, not only because there isn't a huge amount of work that we can in that exact space that we can leverage, but also because of that, there's not a lot of clearly defined methods for doing that are well accepted. So it's really about getting the data, then developing the methods, and then really going out and socializing that with the community.
Yeah, and that's an incredibly important question, Aaron. And it's wonderful to hear that 23andMe are taking steps. And Joyce, you told us that 75% of your folks are white. People are well educated, they are higher income, and so you're going to develop really useful information to predict the joint role of genes and environments in the subset of people who are least affected by the health disparities that we care about. I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room here, right? And I think it's just a really important problem. It's a really important problem as we move into communities that are disparately affected. I'm involved in another project that I did not talk about today, which is trying to interact with African American communities around a newly identified risk factor for chronic kidney disease risk, variations in the APOL1 gene. Very important risk factor. Communities want to know this information, but, and we talked about, and this is in the panel this morning, right now there's nothing we can do to help people who find themselves at higher risk. And so, because, one, there's nothing we can do, and two, it's not fully penetrant, so there's clearly a role for social determinants in expression of the risk phenotype. We need more research. How do we do this? How do we do this work well? And one of the more interesting things from the study that we did, even though we kept telling people, we don't know a lot, we're not sure this will be helpful for you, essentially kind of doing a kind of paternalistic healthcare line, people were like, I don't care. I want this information. Give me this information. And so it just illustrates, I think, the complexities of how to do this work well, where you want people to jointly consider the effects of genes and other social and sort of political factors on their disease expression. And we have all received this lesson in the ether that genes are what matter most, right? And so it's very, very complicated. I welcome other thoughts on this very important problem.
Thank you, Aaron, for that very important question. I want to say I think it's promising within the context of ancestry testing that those who are using the test are not automatically saying it changes who they are. They get that. They live that reality. So a person may be told that they're 70% European ancestry and 30% African ancestry, but their daily life is being perceived as African American and being treated as an African American. And that has a real impact on health. I think it was Troy Duster who said after the sequencing of the Human Genome Project, when it was said that we're all 0.1% different, and he said, well, if race doesn't matter, we may say that race doesn't matter, but when I go out to catch a cab, and when everyone in here who's African American goes out to catch a cab, race will matter, right? And so it brings me to the question of the very real role of environment and social determinants. NPR recently published an article that says when researchers are discriminated against when they want to ask questions about social determinants of health, that the funding is a lot lower when researchers want to ask those questions. There's plenty of research on the problem with the pipeline and diversity and inclusion in terms of who is asking the questions and who is conducting the research. And so I want to ask a question: what can commercial companies do and federal entities do to improve the pipeline, to fund questions around social determinants of health, and to engage people like the genealogists who Alondra Nelson talks about, root seekers, who really want to be engaged in this work? Let's not ignore those individuals. What can we do to increase their opportunities?
Thanks for the question. So, I mean, the problem is largely multifactorial. So again, just in thinking about my own practice, I was thinking about the slide that Dr. Fullerton shared earlier. When you look at variants of uncertain significance, so in my own population, I see lots of variants of uncertain significance that come out as a result of testing, and it always leaves me feeling like I don't necessarily have the best answer for those patients. I think the science really is largely in its infancy. There's still so much that we don't know. There's the influence of gene-environment interactions that still is largely unexplained, particularly when you think about populations in rural areas, especially where coal mining is prevalent and a lot of health disparities exist because of that. So a lot more work has to be done in order to know exactly what the answers are for people when it comes to genetic testing.
Hi, Natasha Pnom. This is a question for Shaniqua Collier. we often hear about, in this discussion, the importance for engagement and companies and industry really wanting to build partnership with communities and build that trust, et cetera, et cetera. For that ad that you showed with the African American woman, was that ad ever pulled, or do you know if the company ever reached out to discuss kind of the backlash that there was? I know I saw it all over Twitter and everything like that. Do you know if there was any that was used as an engagement point to say, maybe we went in a different, or we should have gone in a different direction?
That's a good question. I focused more on the reactions to the ad, and so I don't have a handle on what happened, what the company actually did after the publication of the ad, or whether they pulled it. Maybe someone else in the room or on the panel does.
I think they did pull the ad, but I don't know if they did anything else after that.
Kathy Wickland, Northwestern and NSGC, and thank you all for really doing such a nice job this morning. Shaniqua, I have a question for you. You had talked about that ancestry testing could be an entree, into the genetic testing market. And do you have, I guess, a couple questions. Do you have any data as to whether or not that actually happened? And in what way does it happen? And do you see it as a benefit, or do you see it as, I guess, both benefit and potential harm? If you could just kind of expand upon that.
Well, first, I think that's a complex question to answer in terms of the benefits and harms of African Americans beginning to use the results they get from the Ancestry company and then going to third parties. There may be some data that others on the panel might have with regard to taking raw data and supplying that raw data. I believe Dr. Fullerton said that we don't really know the numbers in terms of how many people actually do that. I think the benefit is in wanting to engage in discussions about genetics and wanting to meet at the community table or at the family table and dig into historical archives and records about family history and understand and learn about whatever connections individuals are able to make. I think there's a benefit in having that discussion, and that it possibly could be expanded if it's done well, and that we're failing people right now in terms of the way we are talking about race and ancestry within the ancestry testing market and in the medical community.
Thank you. And then Joyce, I had a quick question for you. For your Latino population that you talked about wanting to be engaged in research, I was wondering, is that a population that is from the United States, or was that a population that was from outside? Because there was a researcher at ASHE, for those who were there, were talking about how individuals who are not in the United States are more likely to want to be involved in research and more trusting in that process, as opposed to the Latino population that is in the United States. So can you comment on that group?
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of went past it really quickly, but 90% of our customers are from the United States. And so what you're seeing is primarily people from the United States. The other thing is that in terms of looking at the research as well, the IRB protocol is a US IRB. So the vast majority of our research is going to be done in the United States because of that. I wanted to comment a little bit on your previous question too, because I think Shaniqua had sort of brought this up. I mean, one of the things that we sort of observe amongst customers once we had an ancestry-only product was that, that it was quite popular. I think partially because it was less expensive, but I think also partially because it's perhaps a softer introduction to genetics than maybe jumping into health for some people. I mean, one of the things that we talk about is, how do you make the weird wonderful, right? A lot of people find genetics to be weird, right? And so, by putting it into the context of something that feels a little bit more familiar, that they kind of already knew that DNA had to do with family and ancestry has to do with family. I think it is a way to engage people in genetics and get them going on the topic. One example I'll give is that we did a partnership with a community group in the Bayview Hunters Point area of San Francisco, which is a primarily African-American community, because they had an interest in learning more about genetic testing. So people from their community group volunteered to do the testing, and then they had after they got their results, they had a discussion group with each other. And then we did a town hall with them where, there's another couple of hours of discussion. And I mean, at least for me, obviously I don't want to overgeneralize, it's just one group, but I think the engagement of the discussion, right, helps them and helps us not only understand their concerns, but also builds trust, right? So I think, it's important to have the discussions. I think the hard part now is how do you scale those discussions, but the discussion itself is really valuable.
And I just wanted to briefly weigh in on the sort of ancestry health risks question as well. I completely support that more discussion is needed. In our study of direct-to-consumer genetic testing customers who had downloaded their raw data, we were very, very struck by the large number who started basically with a professed, they said in our survey that they were primarily interested in ancestry, and then subsequently became aware that they could take their raw data to other interpretation services and learn health-related information. And there was a great deal of kind of that crosswalk from ancestry to health, and very, very interestingly, in the opposite direction as well. People who had gone to direct-to-consumer genetic testing primarily with a health-related risk question, and then said, gee, I guess I can take this information and put it into a third-party interpretation tool and learn more about my ancestry. So we know that this is going on. We don't know the scale at which this is going on, but I think that Shaniqua's instincts in this regard are absolutely right.
I have a few or couple of clarifying questions for Joyce. On one of the slides you showing there are 80% of participants agree for the research. That's great. My question is, was that 80% agreed for research for using their genetic data or any material if left after their genetic test? What that 80% means for the research?
So that consent specifically allows us to use the genotype information that's generated as part of the test for research. Also, any non-genetic information they provide, for example, as part of our surveys, and any non-genetic information that we use for research is marked as such, so they know. It does also cover, sequencing for research, but which is basically all the rest of that saliva sample is good for.
Okay, so the data generated from the test, not any remaining materials for the test, right?
Yes, except for the sequence comes from another test of the DNA.
Right. Okay. Second clarify question is, one of your slides showing that on computed ethnicity or computed race-based data, I assume that is according to their genetic data, right? Okay. I'm wondering whether you have collected also their self-identified race data. If you do, have you made a comparison, how much difference between the two?
That's a great question. So we do gather self-reported ethnicity data. You have to answer a survey to do that, so the data are not as complete, which is why I did it off the computed ethnicity. It's the most complete data set. The correlations are quite high, generally in the 90% and above. I did have a slide on that, but I just cut it for the sake of time. But I can show you some of that later if you're interested.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Mira Irons from the American Medical Association. This is a wonderful panel. I'm actually following a thread that began at ASHG a few weeks ago when Les Bieseger talked about genetics exceptionalism, something that I think the genetics community has fostered in many ways. And then I heard in the last panel the need for the results to be communicated by a human, but also the potential for 3.6 million inquiries to the medical community over the next few years. And so my question is actually for Dr. Hudson. I was really intrigued with your use of oncology and genetics nurse educators. So I have two questions for you. The first is, are they involved in just the initial screening, or have you used your nurse educators to give results, to talk about abnormal results? And also, my second question is that I have found in my practice that understanding the context of the patient, where that patient sits, where they're from, what their values are, how they look at the world, is really important. And in giving genetic information, that's really important. The fact that your nurse educators are from the community and understand the patients, how much of an impact do you think that is? And how can that teach us to really increase the workforce in terms of this information?
Yeah, those are super questions. So the genetics nurse navigators really are, I titled them that. They're just nurse navigators and kind of the traditional definition of what nurse navigation is. So they tend to follow patients with certain malignancies. When it became evident that simply completing a 3-generation family history questionnaire could be very overwhelming, as well as a deterrent from actually scheduling an appointment with me, I approached them about really just getting this information when they were there to see the oncologist. So when it was clear the oncologist was going to refer the patient, the navigators would sit with the patient maybe for 15, 20 minutes after their visit with the oncologist and at least get a good start on that 3-generation family history questionnaire. Any additional questions that are remaining after that, patients often will go home, call, text family members, try to ascertain more information, and then they call to follow up to see if there's anything else that they can do to complete that information further. That information is then all sent to me so that I can review all of the information in advance of seeing the patient, but I do myself all of the counseling and all of the results disclosure, so I don't use them in that way. But to your point about the contextual knowledge of their background, their family, where they're coming from, that's all incredibly important. So I will often get my schedule of patients for the day, go check in with them, tell me a little bit about each of these patients. So, some will tell me, okay, this is a person with pancreatic cancer. They live an hour and a half away from the clinic. They're here all of the time. If you can also provide them with a gas card for their visit today, that would make a big difference. They usually come with their spouse, so I get all of that information before I actually go into the room, and it makes a huge difference with that understanding when you approach the patients, knowing a little bit more about who they are, where they're coming from, what's happening in the course of their illness. And then also, just kind of on the flip side, I have no problems getting patients to come back in for results. So I think as part of a factor of knowing more about them before I ever even enter the room, as well as the amount of time that I take to meet with them, I think that really ensures that your patients are going to come back and get their results. And I spend a lot of time around just anticipatory guidance about, if you don't want to do testing today, you don't have to do testing today. This requires sometimes communication with your family members. You may want to seek out those discussions before you make a definitive decision about testing. So sometimes patients will leave, talk with family members to let them know that the results that they receive might have implications for them. And then I don't require them to come back for another visit with me before testing. So if they're there for another day for chemo, they can just walk over to the lab. I've already put in the order, and they can have their blood drawn for their testing. So it makes a big difference.
Great, thank you.
So good morning. Thank you for the panel. It was a great panel. My name is Vence Bonham at the National Human Genome Research Institute and a member of the Roundtable. I have two questions, one for Joyce. If you can give a little bit more information about your African American project and your Latino project, the number of participants that you're seeking, your engagement with the community to identify those individuals, any information to have a fuller understanding of those two projects. And then for the full panel, the question of the role that consumer genomics industry, so 23andMe, but all of the industry, can play around issues of genetic literacy and genetics education for lower socioeconomic status members of the United States and public education. Do you see a role for consumer genomic industry with regards to enhancement of genetics education and ultimately the genomic workforce diversity?
So for the African American sequencing project, that's already been completed. It was about 2,000 existing 23andMe customers who we reconsented to get sequenced and then share that data with dbGaP. So those data are now available in dbGaP. The Latino sequencing project we funded internally, so those data are not available on dbGaP. But one of the things that we've been talking about recently is, could we do a partnership with somebody to do a really large non-European reference panel, right, and recruit from our customers to do so, because we can, knowing their genotype information, we can actually select for maximal haplotype coverage. So it could be done very efficiently. So that's something that we've put out there. I think it's something we're going to have to find funding for, just because it's pretty expensive endeavor. In terms of education, it's something we think about a lot. I mean, obviously a more educated consumer can make a more informed decision about whether they want to pursue any kind of genetic testing. I think it's tricky, right, for us. Obviously it's easiest to educate the customers because they're already here. It's obviously a bit of a double-edged sword that they're already educated and on average and well off, just because maybe the gap in understanding is lower, but then of course you're also not getting at huge parts of the population. We have materials that we offer to high school teachers, college students, that sort of thing. I think we haven't necessarily sort of cracked the nut on how to make that really scalable. But I think one of the things that's nice about this as an application that's a consumer-focused application of genetic information is that you can try to make it a little bit more relevant to people. One of the things, one always remembers from school, and my son, who was 9, complains about this all the time, is like, when am I actually going to need to use fractions, right? And, you're kind of like, well, okay, fractions are important, right? And so being able to help people understand, like, listen, yeah, okay, your biology teacher is making you learn about DNA, but like this actually can be relevant to you and your family, and like, here's how like these concepts can actually make it easier for you to understand something useful. So I think there is an opportunity there, something that we should probably try to invest in.
And I'd like to comment on that question as well, especially with regard to the role of commercial companies playing in educating communities. My first reaction is that I wouldn't want to see a top-down approach, but based on community engagement that we're already seeing, and the professors, it might be harder in a rural community, but at least in Washington, D.C., there are professors at Howard University, for example, and other universities that are very passionate about education. There's a strong genealogy community here. I don't know what the networks are in other states and communities, but I think there could be opportunities for partnership so that companies can work together with people who are really interested in educating their community members on how to move forward in that regard.
I would just add that for rural communities, I think the uptake of genetic testing, particularly in the direct-to-consumer space, has yet to be realized. And a lot of work needs to be done in terms of genetics and genomics literacy. So, perhaps starting with a needs assessment of where folks are at, and then tailoring education in that way would be more effective. I've had some patients who have pursued direct-to-consumer tests, and they really don't fully understand the implications, so it feels like a bit of a bait and switch. So they don't have a high educational attainment, and then it's a huge leap then to make that transition from, I decided to do this test, and now this is a lot of information, most of which I don't understand. So I think the gaps are very important to study and to make sure that we're tailoring education in the right way.
Yes, I totally agree. I'm not sure. I want to actually, you kind of threw it in right at the end there, Vence, but I want to talk about the sort of workforce diversification, because I think that's incredibly important. And this is sort of ties back to the previous question that we had about the use of nurse navigators, which is a great model. It's being taken up in a number of different oncology contexts, but when I talk to folks in the medical genetics community, they rarely have heard of it, which is interesting. But in another way, and this kind of gets to Shaniqua's point, if we want to meet communities where they're at, we have this really tried and true, very well crafted innovation of the community health worker and promotores. And they are right there, they're in communities, they have the relationships, they have been trained to give very important preventative health information. They could be providing a crucial role with regard to just helping people to understand the importance of family health history. And they could also be interacting with and helping to educate direct-to-consumers. Now, so where this gets interesting is the relationship between the direct-to-consumer community and this kind of public health model, which comes from a very different space. But there could be intersections between those two groups, and I think it would be fascinating to explore that. It would do a lot to kind of increasing community awareness about genetics and helping people to just sort of have higher literacy about genetics, family health history, the intersection of genetic risk with social determinants in the ways that we were asked about earlier. There's a lot of work that could be done, whether the direct-to-consumer genomic testing community is interested in that particular model. I think it's easier to put a kind of, I mean, and this is going to sound pejorative, and I don't mean that, but it's easier to put a really slick video up on YouTube than it is to spend time on the ground in, federally qualified health centers, in rural settings, and with the folks who are actually trying to help people test their blood sugar, right? But that's where there could be really meaningful intersections there that would make a huge difference, both in terms of diversifying participation, but more importantly, in terms of diversifying the genomics workforce.
Naomi Aronson, Blue Cross and Blue Shield Association, and I'm a member of the roundtable. First, I want to thank all the panelists for their presentations. My comments refer to Dr. Fullerton's presentation in particular, which I really appreciated, the very detailed description of the gaps and disparities that exist in what we know. I do, as you talked about solutions, algorithms were raised, and algorithms, of course, are based on what's presently known. The same way we have gaps and disparities and biases in the genetic information. We certainly have seen it's pretty notorious in the area of facial recognition, for example. So I just wanted to probe a little bit about how you might deploy algorithms in this context of basically uneven, undiverse information as the base.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. I think that's an incredibly important issue. We, of course, just last week had the very important study showing about a biased algorithm that, assigning people to care that was based in basically sort of uncritically using healthcare utilization data that was differentially distributed by race and ethnicity, right? So yes, absolutely, just applying an algorithm to a biased data set, you're going to get, garbage in, garbage out. You're going to get biased answers coming out. But where there is possibility here, and what I was trying to point to, and I just didn't have enough time, is that if you're aware of the biases, and we're exquisitely aware of the biases in the genomic space, right? We're nauseatingly aware of the biases, that you can begin to actually design algorithms that will and this is not my area, so I'm going to probably misuse words, but I'm sure there are very, very smart people in the audience who could explain. But, that basically downweight the data from the white folks, right? And that starts raising alarm bells, right? It's like, what? We're going to ignore useful information? Maybe. In the name of trying to have outcomes be better distributed across there's ways that we can think about this. This is not my area, but there are ways in which we can, it's the way that the algorithms are designed, taking into account the biases. And Joyce is shaking her head. Maybe she can say something more coherent than I can on this question.
I don't want to say too much more because otherwise the statistical geneticists at home might smack me in the face. But I think it is true. Essentially, if you know what you're trying to control for, you can now use that. So I think essentially one of the things that we're trying to do and experimenting with is that there's some information that's shared across groups. There's some information that's private to groups or differential. And so we're trying to leverage some of the shared information across groups to then do a better job with individual groups. Now, one of the keys of this is that you have to test your algorithm to see how it performs. You need to have the group that you're interested in testing in, right? So that's really important. But you can try to you essentially try not to throw away any information, right? You're just trying to leverage the information that's common to make to do something that's more well-informed.
Well, thank you. And if I could just leave with what I hear to be the general principle here is we have thought so much about algorithms as increasing certainty from what we know, and maybe the generalizable principle here is we need to understand algorithms as a tool for understanding uncertainty and its impact.
Okay, hopefully I have a quick question. I'm Daryl Pritchard with the Personalized Medicine Coalition. It's about getting your thoughts on how to report best this health-related data. So my question quickly for Sadie is, in your example of the 31-year-old who was relieved that she didn't have it, was she of Ashkenazi Jewish descent?
No, she was not.
No, she wasn't. So, and I guess that leads to the question of how can we better make clear, what are your thoughts, especially Joyce, on how can we better make clear some of the prevalences of these genetic variants and the markers? We heard Sarah and Dorothy earlier talk about how they clicked through everything just to get to the result. But of course, they were of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, and the results were different, but they missed some of the disclaimers that come up earlier. And I know that 23andMe does a good job with some of those limitations and making them clear and making sure that they make clear that you should bring this data to a genetic counselor. But that period of time that Sarah described between getting that result and talking to a geneticist or a genetic counselor was a cause of high anxiety. So what are your thoughts on better ways to get that reporting and those limitations understood?
So that's a really tough question. I personally don't believe that the disclaimers are emphatic enough about the limitations, particularly to the lay audience, right? So the patient in my case study really had no idea that she was only being tested for three variants. So, that's why she felt so cheated. Here she thought she was getting comprehensive testing, and in fact she wasn't. So, I'm not sure that I know the answer to ensure that the limitations are clear for a very diverse audience. I do know that we have to do a better job of whatever, is on the websites about, frequently asked questions or what you need to know, because it's just as easy on the front end when you're ordering these tests to scroll through everything as it is on the back end when you have results. You're just anxious to get those results, and you just kind of click through. So we do need to do a better job of making clear what is involved in testing, what the limitations are of testing. And then again, in the research that I presented, it's clear that people do want to talk with healthcare providers, even about engaging with direct-to-consumer testing. But healthcare providers aren't necessarily having these discussions with patients. So then the question becomes, who is best to inform the patients about the appropriateness of direct-to-consumer or any other type of testing, genetic testing, and how do we make clear the limitations of testing across the board?
So I think it's a great question. You know, I mean, obviously it makes me really sad to think that there are people that we're not serving well. And so, you know, actually, you know, sort of coincidentally, one of the things that we've been thinking about more recently is that, you know, there is a wide array of genetic testing available to people nowadays. And how do you help guide them to what is most appropriate for them, right? I mean, the reality is, you know, in the case where somebody has for example, a personal or strong family history of breast and ovarian cancer, then probably something more comprehensive is indicated, and that is the kind of testing they should probably get. So how could we help guide people to say, look, you can do this, but, you know, here's something that might actually make more sense for you, right? And I think that there are ways to do that, that we should think about, you know, how we could implement. I guess the other thing that I was thinking about is that, you know, there's always this challenge, I think, and this friction between wanting prompt access to results, but also wanting to be guided through that experience, right? Like, essentially what you want is like, well, I want the information when I want it, and I want somebody there to talk to me when I get it, right? But it's not, you know, it's not, we haven't cracked that nut. And I would say that, like, say, at least from my own personal experiences with the healthcare system, I don't think they have either. You know, I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever gotten a result on Friday afternoon and been like, seriously, like, why did you give that to me now when I have the whole weekend to perseverate about it, right? Or, you know, you find out something and you're like, well, the next time we can get you a follow-up appointment is 2 weeks or 2 months from now, right? And, you know, I mean, you know that they're doing their best, right? They have all of their other things that they're dealing with. But as an individual, of course, that's very stressful, right? So I suspect we're all looking for that answer. And, you know, one of the things we were trying to do with direct-to-consumer testing is, you know, how can we provide that support in a more scalable fashion? Because I think we would all love to provide a really personal touch, but there's only so many people that do that.
So just keeping us on schedule, we have about 5 minutes remaining for questions. So I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
I just have 2 quick comments. This is I don't mean this to be Pollyanna-ish, but there is one other aspect of trying to figure out what's going on with the variants of uncertain significance that we're finding, and that is the development of massively parallel deleteriousness testing as pioneered by people like Jay Shinduri and other people at University of Washington and Fritz Roth at University of Toronto, which is unbiased, essentially. It's putting in every mutation you can in certain genes. Now, that's not the same as pathogenic. Deleterious has to do with gene function, pathogenic has to do with clinical impact, but it does add some information. And the only other comment I wanted to make, and then Stephanie wants to jump in, the only comment I wanted to make has to do with the downloading of raw data and running that through third-party. People mentioned that both Ambry Genetics and Invitae both have had lots of patients referred to them with really serious, frightening results, and half of them are wrong. They're analytically validity wrong. The variants are not there.
On the latter point first, yep. You know, the raw data are very well QC'd for the subset of sites that are returned directly as part of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing process, and the rest of it is subject to the same level of background error that is typical of a non-clinical grade test. And so it's not surprising, and yes, it's a huge concern, and I think it's a larger conversation, maybe we'll have over lunch, you know, of what to do about this, but I think it's very important that people be aware of it, and it doesn't surprise me that you all have been fending off those kinds of inquiries. On the issue of the kind of massively parallel deleterious testing, I agree. It's amazing that they can do that. And my one word back to you is penetrance. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, so we can design a really great in vitro assay which tells us that particular changes are breaking genes. It doesn't tell us about what the the health impact of those changes are going to be. So I think there's some movement there to change a VUS into a clinically meaningful test result. But I agree, it's very promising.
Just wanted to add one thing, and this is mostly speculation on my part, but I think, you know, the move of people taking their data to these third-party groups like Prometheus might have been one unintended consequence of the FDA action, right? Because now, you know, there isn't anybody to provide that information. People then go to what's available. So, I mean, it's tricky, right? You want people to own their information, but how do you make sure that they're getting to use it in a way that is responsible?
So this will be our last question.
Fair enough. So first, I think a very quick question, and the next would be longer, but we'll make it a placeholder for a conversation later in the day. It's Greg Fiero. So the first question is for Joyce. Have you segmented your data by time of enrollment in 23andMe services? So getting back to the question this morning of whether or not there's evolution over time in terms of the types of adopters, their wants, wishes, and desires, it seems like you might have an opportunity if you simply bin people in 2-year bins and looked to see if there's evolution in sort of willingness to participate in research, you know, other types of questions. Has that been done?
So we do look at that. I mean, we're certainly capable of looking at that. I don't necessarily have a lot of that information off the top of my head. One thing I can tell you, because I watch the consent rate like a hawk, is that has been remarkably consistent.
It's been stable.
Over the whole time. And I mean, I'm somewhat surprised. I mean, people kept on making dire predictions that as the price of the product went down, and you saw more people gifting it, and so the average sort of education and income also went down, that, you know, people would be less willing to participate in research. We have not seen that yet. Maybe that will happen at some point in the future, but we haven't seen it. Like I said, too, the age distribution, I think, has smoothed a little bit, but has been bimodal since the beginning. So primarily, I think what you'll see is with the decrease in the cost, right? Because remember, in 2007, all these services cost anywhere between $1,000 to $2,000. You know, like, more people can afford it, right?
Yeah, I would have predicted the gifting potentially would result in a decrease in the interest and consent for research over time as people that kind of were brought into it, not being information seekers particularly. Interesting. So the placeholder is basically, I'm having a hard time sort of in my mind sort of understanding the Venn diagram between issues surrounding rurality and its impact on health disparities versus race and ancestry and their impact on healthcare disparities. I assume there's a fairly large amount of overlap between the issues, but they're not complete. And I'm wondering if, you know, in later sessions, we might be able to think about how we can tease out sort of issues that are shared in common, issues that are different, and what that could mean for the roundtable, perhaps, moving forward.
Well, thank you so much to our excellent panelists here for the stimulating discussion, and thank you all for your time and attention.